Hey everyone, I would like to thank those who found my previous video quite valuable, and I'm thankful for the amount of responses I have from Filipinos and other Asian Americans. I was surprised by a lot of comments coming from Filipinos straight from the motherland. Now, before I dive deep into this video's topic, I would like to start with a story, The Ant and the Grasshopper, a story attributed by Aesop, a Greek slave of African descent. His fables are taught today as moral lessons, and most of us in the developed world pretty much knows the story of the ant and the grasshopper. So the story usually goes that there was once a grasshopper who's just relaxing one day and observes an ant passing by. The grasshopper asks why they're doing this, and so the ant explains that this is how they preserve their goods after working hard. That way they have a bounty saved up as a result of their hard work. Now we all know what happens here during the winter. It comes and the grasshopper starves and suffers for not having done the same thing the ants have, despite being a completely different species of insect, which is besides the point anyway. Now, we all know the moral of the story here, right? So just let that story linger awkwardly in the background of your mind for now. I had a conversation with a friend of mine about overseas Filipino workers. Like many other immigrants, much of their time is spent on labor, while the remaining hours are compromised. But I pondered whether this was due to their conditioning. Her observation was that, being raised Filipino herself, they tell her that life is short and they want to enjoy as much as they can. And she realized that joy and happiness is all subjective, are they not? Surely not everyone imagines themselves toiling away in the same conditions as these workers do. Anyway, this discussion got me to think about how we define work and laziness, because you'd be surprised to see what people are saying about the Filipino working class. What I found to be a constant theme in these opinions is the paradoxical idea that Filipinos are hardworking, but also lazy because of the leftist employment system. Jesus, this is going to be a doozy. This ignores a tremendous amount of context. You see, in the United States, it is easy to fire people because the risk of impact workers have in production, or in actual human terms, because the culture favors companies over its workers. As a result of this, most people who are conditioned to believe in laziness would say things like, "Lazy people are killing our economy." The social and political history of the Philippines also borrows from American culture as well, so it's not surprising that both Americans and Filipinos also share this definition of work and also have an anti-communist or anti-leftist sentiment. There's even a satirical stab at leftist figures in history like Karl Marx in the video game Assassin's Creed Syndicate, where the developers would insert commentary to describe the effects of his popularity in a demeaning way, being made fun of just because of his impact in studying class structure. While that may be true, why is that? What's communism and politics have to do with laziness? Well, those of you who are unfamiliar with American political history, during the Cold War era, there used to be a full-fledged campaign known as McCarthyism, which targeted alleged communists in the U.S. government and other institutions carried out under Senator Joseph McCarthy. Many of these accused were blacklisted and lost their jobs, but most of them were not actually communist. Interesting. What has been trending in the Philippines for months now is something eerily similar. It is known as red tagging. It refers to the malicious blacklisting of individuals or organizations critical or not fully supportive of the actions of the government, regardless of their actual political beliefs. The practice equates many left-wing activists with terrorism. Rights activists say it is now being used against doctors, activists, academics, students, and journalists, among others. Around the same time as the McCarthyism era, there was a renowned Filipino journalist and historian by the name of Renato Constantino. Now, I bring attention to this important man because he is known for his research on early and post-colonialism in the Philippines, and one of his famous works, The Philippines, A Past Revisited, which extends his research into how the identity and historical narrative of the beloved country was framed by colonialism. In this highly otherwise dense work, Constantino critiques the way the first colonizers treated the natives of what used to be known as the East Indies. The book essentially documents how the conquistadors treated their lifestyle with prejudice. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, the first governor-general who established the first Spanish settlement, called the Filipinos lazy and blamed them for not being in good shape. They were later divided by beliefs and other subcultures based on region. One of the ways in which this happened was the encomienda system. It was a system that granted conquerors with the labor of indigenous non-Christian people, a system also employed in South America. The division of many regions into the encomiendas created a form of compulsory work. The masters were also given the responsibility to evangelize the natives working for them. Many became indentured servants for households. Whether or not this was considered slavery remains debatable, but compulsory work is that, compulsory, and they didn't have a choice. At least this didn't last long, and the system was abolished pretty shortly, unlike some other country we know. And all Filipinos know how the rest became history when Jose Rizal became our national hero, arguing for independence from Spain. However, Constantino was also known to question the validity of Rizal's symbolism. In Constantino's 1969 lecture, Veneration Without Understanding, he argued that Rizal was American-sponsored and was to be seen as a nationalist only. Many adherents of Constantino support his anti-elitist views, while his critics accuse him for being obsessed with class structure. Sound familiar? Regardless of the comparisons, both Rizal and Constantino were clearly interested in the sociology of their own people, and pointed out that the Spanish colonial bureaucracy that discriminated against the indigenous was due to the presumed backwardness. So we see how politics is shaped by our sociology. Sociologist Thorsten Veblen studied the pursuit of wealth and consumerist lifestyle in American society. In his most famous work, The Theory of the Leisure Class, he found that the function of the rising middle class was derived from the social stratification and the division of labor, which were used to exploit people at the bottom of the food chain and reinforce consumption. And I want you to keep those two terms in mind. Decades later after him, Bertrand Russell, a British philosopher, wrote about the idea of laziness as a projection rather than a description in response to this wealth and work pursuit mindset. In his essay In Praise of Idleness, he argues that if people were only allowed to work for a few hours in the day, they would be happier and healthier, and actually more productive members of society, by means of also de-escalating the pursuit of profit and eradicating unemployment. So my point here is that the rise and protection of the middle class and their wealth has prevailed after the colonial era, and despite their free association from the monarchy of the past, they continue to pride themselves as the most productive and most intellectual of the class hierarchy. They are even well celebrated in American society, and interestingly in the Philippines as well. There's even a show called Ilustrado, the official name for the Filipino middle class at the brink of the turn of the century. And the continued stratification and disconnect from the working class distances their observation of actual work, therefore less likely to empathize or understand the reality of their situation. According to the book Laziness Does Not Exist by Devin Price, the author explores the psychological foundation of the laziness lie, including its origins from the Protestant work ethic and how this continues to manifest within capitalism today, and how the boundaries between work and life have become blurred. The Protestant work ethic was coined by German sociologist Max Weber, a concept that was an attractive component among areas of historically Puritan and later Protestant majority. The idea of work and personal life were melded into one, and continues to be a dominant mindset. Sometimes we are in denial in how work culture impacts us. We celebrate people like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford for being so generous to their workers. Calling for a mere 6-day-a-week from the atrocious 7-day-a-week work life because they thought one day was just enough for human time. With Andrew Carnegie, it's arguably worse. His toxic ideas are out in the open with his book, The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argues that the unequal distribution of wealth revolutionized human life for the good because he thought it benefited the poor. He believed that wealth is earned through the natural order of things, in other words, survival of the fittest, an idea that certain people become powerful because they were innately better. Literally, from his book, he writes, individualism will continue, but the millionaire will be but a trustee for the poor, entrusted for a season with a great part of the increased wealth of the community, but administering it for the community far better than it could or would have done for itself. This kind of sophistry has been used to justify imperialism, racism, eugenics, and social inequality in just over the past century and a half. In the 1970s onward, refugees from Southeast Asian nations like Vietnam and the Philippines, from the ravages of the Vietnam War and the Second World War, sought the United States as the land of opportunity, only to be taken advantage of by personalities like that of Carnegie, industrial elites who used the survival of the fittest mindset and mechanisms like division of labor and social stratification to justify racism and perception of immigrants having inferior intelligence. The only difference now is that America found a way to further accelerate its workforce and drive profit in this new wave of immigration. Decades later, they outsource work from other countries in hopes to alleviate economic conditions like the debt crisis. On the topic of debt alone, the rabbit hole runs even deeper. Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Jefferson knew that financial hardship can be used for social control, such as driving indigenous communities into debt so they can give up their land and repossess them. By the 1970s, personal debts exploded, and eventually student debt as well, echoing the same colonial tactic that came before. The same principle applies during the early American occupation of the Philippines. Despite the country having gained independence from Spain and a temporary Commonwealth status, American influence played a vital role in the establishment of nursing as an attractive profession. This allowed American Protestants as well as Baptist missionaries to set up nursing schools to further perpetuate exploitation. This created the perfect ideological formula to sell to those who needed a better life and to give in to social control for future generations. This was how the Filipino nurse stereotype came to be. As you can see, this perpetual Protestant work ethic has always been pervasive. The division of labor and social stratification keeps lesser folk and immigrants in line. Ideas like the redistribution of wealth is an antithesis to the American way of life. That is why ideas like communism or socialism is a big no-no. With all that woke language out of the way, how does the historical context apply to our generation? I spoke with a few content creators of various fields to get their insight into this issue. One vlogger by the name of Nicole talks about the significance of emotional quotient, or otherwise known as emotional intelligence in Filipino culture.
They're kind of used interchangeably, but really what it measures or what it's all about is really the ability to relate and understand yourself. If I were to sum up EQ, it would kind of be like the ability of having social skills, and that also ties into being able to, be a good team member, be a good leader, things like that. There's an interesting dynamic with first generation Filipinos with their parents that, are immigrants here in the States, where there's this sort of dichotomy of expectations where we're growing up in a culture that's very different from what our parents have, but our parents have a different set of expectations for us, and just trying to find that in between of, fitting in here in the now with our groups of friends growing up and the kind of culture that we're seeing, but also being good daughters or good sons to our parents that worked really hard to give us the kind of life that they wish they had growing up. You know what I mean?
That goes along with the whole model minority myth. For a majority of Asians who immigrated to America, they're automatically othered just by the way that they look. So they knew that they had to exceed at a ridiculous rate to make it like undeniable that they not only belonged here, but they had value being here and they were bringing value to this country. And what happens though is that like when you are sub exceptional, you know, which is still good, it's like here's exceptional and you're just like a little bit under, that's seen as like not being good. And so that also is really, that was something really difficult to grasp just like as a kid, because it's so funny looking back at school and truly understanding how little your GPA matters in the scheme of your life.
This also has an effect on how local businesses treat each other. Another friend of mine expressed his observations about the competitive attitude in the local community and among Filipino creatives.
When I was growing up, like being a teenager, man, it was all about like sticking together with all Filipinos, looking out for one another and being tight. And we're so talented as a people, and I don't think that and not so much, just like competing against one another. I mean, Filipino artists in the Hampton Roads area, we're freaking cutthroat each other, and that's crazy. I've seen it behind the scenes, but moving forward, the only way that the Filipino community is going to grow is if we actually genuinely look out for one another. I'm not talking about, just painting and illustrating, but also other restaurants too. I mean, there's so many talented, good souls out there. I mean, especially in the yoga community. I think one of the biggest things too in Filipino culture is that we sweep things under the rug. You know what I mean? We don't face them.
That we don't really talk about our emotions, at least from what I experienced. We don't really like acknowledge any hardships in life. I remember like, cry over something, whether it be like a breakup or like a scraped knee. I was just told to like, not let anyone see that my tears, sort of thing. So
even though, with Filipino culture in general, it's just all about the image. I mean, who cares? Who cares about the image? You know what I mean? It's just, why don't you just be real from now on? Like moving forward, how we can be real is just really, really accept ourselves for who we are instead of who we're trying to portray ourselves to be. I think it's really, really important for Filipinos to really talk about really what's bothering them, what's really on their mind.
I also spoke to this amazing writer who gave a significant insight on how this toxic ideology impacts other Southeast Asian Americans.
It's in the creation of the model minority myth. It's also like some of us come from ethnic backgrounds where immigrating to an entirely new country where you don't speak the language and the environment is hostile and structures aren't built for you, like it makes total sense why our parents would err on the side of caution.
It's usually, I feel like it comes down to them saying, well, we had to suffer. Like when you start like comparing traumas, well, my therapist called it like there's big T traumas and little T traumas. Like the little T traumas are the ones that, aren't very like violent or outrageous, but they still impact you in a huge way.
If anyone wants to talk about the American dream, like look at the Asian Americans, they're fine. Like we're not fine. Like that's like their excuse for not providing us with resources and the support that we need. Like they're just like, oh, y'all made it, we're good. I built my own success, blah blah. Okay, like good for you, but like what about all the people who haven't? What about like Southeast Asian Americans? Just like when you disaggregate the data, it's clearly like there's a class differences among ethnicities, and you don't just get to like be like they're doing fine and then ignore like all of the people who are like lower class and really need a lot of structural support. And also like immigration laws were extremely racist. So a lot of people, like, one stereotype is like, haha, like, we're good at like math and science. Like, bro, you created that stereotype. Like, you only let people in to the US if they were good at STEM. All of these things have real, like, they were done on purpose, is what I'm saying. Like, personally, I don't care about someone's success. And if they do, like, I look at the conditions that they grew up in. Do you live in a city with good resources? Did you have access to good education, quality education? Did you have access to opportunities, right? Are you a dude? Like, first of all, I am like happy for this dude that he's done so much, but opportunity is hard work and it's also luck.
I know what some of you are thinking, but what about people who love their job? Is it their fault for identifying with their work? Well, actually, there is a sense of collective contempt among everyday people and freelancers towards their clients and superiors. It also not has anything necessarily to do with the product or service itself, but the conditions of their work. Sarah Jaff's book, Work Won't Love You Back, examines the myth of how work ought to be perceived and undermining the financial stress.
Work is this super important thing. And then you get fired, then the answer is always like, you just didn't love it enough. You weren't passionate enough. You didn't like devote yourself to it enough. So, you know, like the love your job is not, it's like as much a threat as anything else. It's kind of like, you better love this job.
The book documents stories told through the lives and experiences of workers in various industries. Now, that is not to say we can easily judge someone's life choices. Labor alone can drain your energy from other important things like taking care of children, fun hobbies, relationships, their true passions, or even just thinking. What's actually insidious is that the kind of toxic beliefs people like Carnegie holds disguise themselves in the field of self-help. Alice Cappelle is another content creator whose ideas I admire, so I spoke with her on the topic of self-help and its ideological implications.
I was really into self-help, and when I realized that it was just BS, and I started to get more involved into social sciences, etc., this idea that we frame ideologies, some ideologies, on random facts. So there was like this mistake here, and you know, like there's this thing, this stereotype in France that you hear a lot is that Chinese restaurants or Asian restaurants in general, they have issues with like security or norms or stuff like that. That's something you hear a lot here. I don't know, it's just a French thing or something. And you know, I think it's probably just based on like a random thing that happened here and there, and it's just made up into a narrative. But just in general with self-help, you know, they're going to say things that sounds very natural, but that you, I, and most people who have built those habits of always questioning and stuff will perceive as something that is, yeah, as you said, quite harmful, can tell a lot. So that, okay, you're on level 1, you think that, but like maybe if you watch a little bit of Jordan Peterson, or if you watch a little bit of Ben Shapiro, you might move to something a bit, you know, a bit like a bit more political, because there's no such thing as being apolitical. Being apolitical is just reflecting, means that you conform to the system, and depending on the country, I know in France, like we move to something quite right-wing. So if you're apolitical, it means that you're supporting a system that is quite right-wing. So you are right-wing, even if you say you're not political.
So what Alice was getting at here is that in the self-help space, people are sometimes conditioned to feel as though they have escaped the system and learn to think independently. But in the end, this is still very contingent on the culture you were raised in and the information you absorb around you. It doesn't matter how much of your beliefs you dissent from. You will eventually default to your French conservative environment, or in America, an American conservative environment. This is evident in Filipino culture as well. There is a concept known as the mañana habit. It's a phrase borrowed from the Spanish during their occupation of the Philippines, disparagingly defined for people who procrastinate. In colloquial Tagalog dialect, we also say mamaya na, a phrase someone says when they want to put something off. Studies have actually shown that procrastination and laziness has less to do with time management and more to do with negative emotions. So why do people continue to have negative emotions then? Surely, if one were to have common sense, we should stop with the guilt tripping and the laziness lie, right? Well, according to culture theorist Antonio Gramsci, it's not so much that people are intentionally malicious or blind to the truth, so to speak, about colonization and capitalism, but it's that we live in a hegemonic culture. In other words, those in power form their own values and propagate these ideas and sell them to us and the economy, and we consent to them as part of the norm. Just 2 years ago, a living culture theorist, Slavoj Žižek, had an interview with Barbara Bleisch, another philosopher, explaining what thinkers like Gramsci meant by hegemonic culture.
Sehr, sehr viel Freiheiten. Dennoch sehen sie uns ein Stück weit als verknechtete Individuen.
Ideology is more than ever something that structures our daily life. Let's say you have 5,000 euros. You can freely decide how to invest them. Buy healthcare, go to a nice holiday, pay special studium for your son. You see the trick. What is actually a new form of anxiety, permanent stress, is sold to you as a new form of freedom.
So phrases like mamayana perpetuate the idea of laziness as part of the norm, despite its colonial context. And so living in a society that sells the concept of freedom as part of the anxiety-driven work culture makes it hard to challenge these ideas, since the focus is on survival. And speaking of survival, if I were to show you the quote, "The man who acquires the ability to take full possession of his own mind may take possession of anything else to which he is justly entitled," you might think this is either inspiring or pretentious. This is a quote by Andrew Carnegie, by the way, and so you can see where 2 and 2 come together. Journalist Anand Giridharadas, by the way, not to be confused with Caesar Flickerman from the Hunger Games, argues that members of the global elite use their wealth and influence to preserve systems and concentrate that wealth at the top, at the expense of societal progress, while distracting us with lip service of goodwill.
There has been an ideology for the last 40 years that is the ideology of win-win. The rich people don't have to pay any more taxes. They don't have to be regulated anymore, and it is a lie. The only change worth doing in a moment like this with such inequity make the plutocrats less powerful. The answer to a winners-take-all world is almost logically a world in which the winners take less.
And not to mention that people like Carnegie and Ford engage in philanthropy with their idea of using money to change the world. A lot of this misunderstanding of the unemployment issue stems from the selling of capitalism as an idyllic freedom, which is why laziness is often misattributed to millennials and Gen Zs not going up to work. This is why people who agree with this nonsense often blame this laziness as a result of an imaginary communism. I won't need to get into further detail into how this creates a vast sea of problems for the sake of time. To briefly summarize my thesis, these systems are set up to maintain capitalism by accelerating an already compulsory working society, while marketing this as a form of idyllic freedom. So you're probably now asking, what do we do with all of this? What now? Well, first off, I will ask those of you who are completely on board with my essay to not judge others. Not everyone in the workforce is going to buy into this lefty attitude of mine, and that's okay. I'm not going to expect young college students working at Chick-fil-A to suddenly rise up and seize the means of production just because of the chain's association with anti-gay campaigns. I honestly have no intention of getting on a high horse, making anyone who eats there feel guilty, and that's a whole other discussion. Point is, survival and patience is still an essential process when working with all kinds of people. Now, I'm not suggesting that you immediately welcome a neoconservative fascist weeb into the discourse, but that not all disagreements have to be a deal breaker. After all, humans are multifaceted beings, each with their own way of managing time, priorities, and forms of communication. Not to mention that forms of oppression and moral stakes are relative to identity and the ability to empathize. Every individual has their own way of navigating the current state of affairs. And for those of us in the creative field, i.e. freelancers, artists, and other creatives, we at least have the ability to subvert the dominant ideology through storytelling and satire. The very nature of the creative field is not even a stable one, nor does it follow the rules of capitalism, interestingly. But more on that another time. I decided to cut this video on the laziness lie into 2 parts because I want this to be a source of reflection before anticipating the rest of my essay. I hope this gives you a clear understanding of my gripe with the idea of laziness and how it pervades our culture. So, to answer the most pressing question of my thumbnail, are Filipinos lazy? No.